You are in my book playlist, and I am Daisy, your hostess. You're joining me now as we have embarked on the reading of the book titled The Book of Life, written by Upton Sinclair and published in 1921 by the Payne Book Company in Chicago. It is in the public domain. If you are new to the channel and you're coming across this video for the first time with this book and would like to catch up, you can go to my book playlist and grab the whole book there in its entirety. Otherwise, let's move on to Chapter 8, The Virtue of Moderation. Attempts to show that wise conduct is an adjustment of means to ends and depends upon the understanding of a particular set of circumstances. Some years ago, I used to know an ardent single tax propagandist who found my way of arguing intensely irritating because, as he phrased it, I had no principles. We would be discussing, for example, a protective tariff, and I would wish to collect statistics, but discovered to my bewilderment that to my single tax friend a custom duty was stealing on the part of the government. The government had a right to tax land because that was the gift of nature, but it had no right to tax the products of human labor, and when it took a portion of the goods which anyone brought into a country, the government was playing the part of a robber. Of course, such a man was annoyed by the suggestion that in the early stages of a country's development, it might possibly be a good thing for the country to make itself independent and self-sufficient by encouraging the development of its manufacturers. That, on the other hand, when these manufacturers had grown to such a size that they controlled the government, it might be an excellent thing for the country to subject them to the pressure of foreign competition in order to lower their value as a preliminary to socializing them. The reader who comes to this book looking for hard and fast rules of life will be disappointed. It would be convenient if someone could lay down for us a moral code and lift from our shoulders the inconvenient responsibility of deciding about our own lives. There may be persons so weak that they have to have the conditions of their lives thus determined for them. But I'm not writing for such persons. I am writing for adult and responsible individuals, and I bear in mind that every individual is a separate problem, with separate needs and separate duties. There are, of course, a good many rules that apply to everybody in almost all emergencies, but I cannot think of a single rule that I would be willing to say I would apply in my life without a single exception. Thou shalt not kill is a rule that I have followed, so far without exception. But as soon as I turn my imagination loose, I can think of many circumstances under which I should kill. I remember discussing the matter with a pacifist friend of mine, an out-and-out religious non-resistant. I pointed out to him that people sometimes went insane, and in that condition they sometimes seized hatchets and killed anyone in sight. What would my pacifist friend do if he saw a maniac attacking his children with a hatchet? It did not help him to say that he would use all possible means short of killing the maniac. He had finally to admit that if he were quite sure it was a question of the life of the maniac or the life of his child, he would kill. And this is not mere verbal quibbling, because such things do happen in the world, and people are confronted with such emergencies, and they have to decide. And no rule is a general rule if it has a single exception. There is a saying that the exception proves the rule, but this is very silly. It is a mistranslation of the Latin word probat, which means not proves, but tests. No exception can prove a rule. What the exception does is to test the rule by showing that the result does not follow in the exceptional case. The only kind of rule which can be laid down for human conduct is a rule in such general terms that it escapes exceptions by leaving the matter open for every man's difference of opinion. Any kind of rule which is specific will sooner or later pass out of date. Take, by way of illustration, the ancient and well-established virtue of frugality. Obviously, under a state of nature or of economic competition, it is necessary for every man to lay by a store for a rainy day. But suppose we could set up a condition of economic security under which society guaranteed to every man the full product of his labor, and the old and the sick were fully taken care of. Then how foolish a man would seem who troubled to acquire a surplus of goods. It would be as if we saw him riding on horseback through the main street of our town in a full suit of armor. I devote a good deal of space to this question of a fixed and unchangeable morality, because it is one of the heaviest burdens that mankind carries upon its back. The record of human history is sickening, not so much because of blood and slaughter, but because of fanaticism, because wherever the mind of man attempts to assert itself, to escape from the blind rule of animal greed, it adopts a set of formulas and proceeds to enforce them, regardless of consequences, upon the whole of life. Consider, for example, the rule of the Puritans in England. The Puritans glorified conscience, and it is perfectly proper to glorify conscience, but not to the entire suppression of the beauty-making faculties in man. Macaulay summed up the Puritan point of view in the sentence that they objected to bear baiting, not because it gave pain to the bear, but because it gave pleasure to the spectators. As a result of applying that principle and lacing mankind in a straitjacket by legislation, England swung back into a reaction under the Cavaliers in which debauchery held more complete sway than ever before or since in English life. This is a hard lesson, but it must be learned. There is no virtue that does not become a vice if it is carried to extremes. There is no virtue that does not become a vice if it is applied at the wrong time, or under the wrong circumstances, or at the wrong stage of human development. In fact, we may say that most vices are virtues misapplied. The so-called natural vices are simply natural impulses carried to excess, while the unnatural vices result from the suppression and distortion of natural impulses. The Greeks had as their supreme virtue what they called sophrosyne. It is a beautiful word, worth remembering. It means a beautiful quality called moderation. We shall find as we come to investigate that life is a series of compromises among many different needs, many different desires, many different duties, and reason sits as a wise and patient judge and appoints to each its proper portion, and denies to it an excess which would starve the others. Such is true morality, and it is incompatible with the existence of any fixed code, whether of human origin or divine. The fixed morality is a survival of a far-off past, of the days of instinct and servitude. Human reason has developed but slowly, and perhaps only a few people are as yet entirely capable of taking control of their own destiny. Perhaps it is really dangerous to think for oneself. But if we investigate carefully, if we decide that the danger is not so much to ourselves as it is to others, the most evil of all the habits that man has inherited from his far-off past is the habit of exploiting his fellows. And in order to exploit them more safely, the ruling castes of priests and kings and nobles and property owners have taken possession of the moralities of the world and shape them for their own convenience. They have taught the slave virtues of credulity and submission. They have surrounded their teachings with all the terrors of the supernatural. They have placed upon rebellion the penalties, not merely of this world, but of the next, not merely of the dungeon and the rack, but of hellfire and brimstone. I do not wish to go to extremes and say that the moral codes now taught in the world are made holy in this evil way. As a matter of fact, they are a queer jumble of the two elements, the slave terrors of the past and the common sense of the present. There is not one moral code in the world today. There are many. There's one for the rich and one entirely different one for the poor. And the rich have had a great deal more to do with shaping the code of the poor than the poor have had to do with shaping the code of the rich. There is one code for governments and an entirely different one for the victims of governments. There is one code for business and an entirely different one, a far more human and decent one, for friendship. Above all, there is one code for Sunday and another code for the other 6 days of the week. Most of our idealisms and our sentimental fine phrases we reserve for our Sunday code, while for our everyday code we go back to the rule of the jungle. Dog eat dog, or do unto others as they would do unto you, but do it first. When you attempt to suggest a new moral code to our present-day moral authorities, it is the fine phrases of the Sunday code they bring out for exhibition purposes. And perhaps you are impressed by their arguments until Monday morning, when you attempt to apply this code at the office and they stare at you in bewilderment or burst out laughing in your face. What I'm trying to do here is to outline a code that will not be a matter of phrases, but a matter of practice. It will apply to all men, rich as well as poor, and to all 7 days of the week. I am not suggesting a code as pointing out to you how you can work out your own code for yourself. I am suggesting that you should adopt it not because I tell you to, but because you yourself have taken it and tested it, precisely as you would test any other of the practical affairs of your life. Potatoes as an article of diet, or some particular sack of potatoes that a peddler was trying to sell to you. It is not yet possible for you to be as sure about everything in your life as you can be about a sack of potatoes. Human knowledge has not got that far, but at least you can know what is to be known. And if anything is a matter of uncertainty, you can know that. Such knowledge is often the most important of all. Just as the driver of an automobile wants to know if a bridge is not to be depended on. So I say to you that if you want to find happiness in this life, look with distrust upon all absolutes and ultimates, all hard and fast rules, all formulas and dogmas, and general principles. Bear in mind that there are many factors in every case. There are many complications in every human being. There are many sides to every question. Try to keep an open mind and an even temper. Try to take an interest in learning something new every day and in trying some new experiment. This is the scientific attitude toward life. This is the way of growth and of true success. It is inconvenient because it involves working your brains, and most people have not been taught to do this and find it the hardest kind of work there is. But how much better it is to think for yourself and to protect yourself than to trust your thinking to some group of people whose only interest may be to exploit you for their advantage. End of chapter 8. Stay with me. We're going to roll through now to chapter 9. I would kindly ask if you can help my channel grow, hit that like button. The YouTube algorithm likes that, and share the channel with your friends. Okay, if you want to go ahead and put it on pause, grab your coffee, grab your tea, and depending on what time of day, grab your wine. I'm flipping the page to Chapter 9, The Choosing of Life. Discusses the standards by which we may judge what is best in life and decide what we wish to make of it. We have made the point about evolution, that it may go forward or it may go backward. There is no guarantee in nature that because a thing changes, it must necessarily become better than it was. On the contrary, degeneration is as definitely established a fact as growth, and it is of the utmost importance in studying the problem of human happiness and how to make it, to get clear the fact that nature has produced and continues to produce all kinds of monstrosities and parasites and failures and abortions. And all these blunders of our great mother struggle just as hard, desire life just as ardently as normal creatures, and suffer just as cruelly when they fail. Blind optimism about life is just as fatuous and just as dangerous as blind pessimism. And if we propose to take charge of life and to make it over, we shall find that we have to get quickly to the task of deciding what our purpose is. Choose well. Your choice is brief and yet endless, says Carlyle. You are driven in your choice by two facts. First, that you have to choose, regardless of whether you want to or not. And second, that upon your choice depend infinite possibilities of happiness or of misery. The interdependence of life is such that you are choosing not merely for the present, but for the future. You are choosing for your posterity forever, and to some extent, you are choosing for all mankind. Matthew Arnold has said that conduct is 3/4 of life, but I, for my part, have never been able to see where he got his figures. It seems to me that conduct is practically everything in life that really counts. Conduct is not merely marriage and birth and premature death. It is not merely eating and drinking and sleeping. It is thinking and aspiring. It is religion and science, music and literature and art. It is not yet the lightning and the cyclone, but with the spread of knowledge, it is coming to be these things. And I suspect that someday it may be even the comet and the rising of the sun. We are now going to apply our reason to this enormous problem of human conduct. We are going to ask ourselves the question, what kind of life do we want? What kind of life are we going to make? What are the standards by which we may know excellence in life and distinguish it from failure and waste and blunder in life? Obviously, when we have done this, we shall have solved the moral problem. All we shall have to say is, act so that your actions help to bring the desirable things into being, and do not act as to hinder or weaken them. We shall not be able to go to nature to settle this question for us. This is our problem, not nature's. But we shall find, as usual, that we can pick up precious hints from her. We shall be wise to study her ways and learn from her successes and her failures. We are proud of her latest product, ourselves. Let us see how she made us. What were the stages on the way to man? First in the scale of evolution, it appears, came inert matter. We call it inert because it looks that way, though we know, of course, that it consists of infinite numbers of molecules vibrating with speed which we can measure even though we cannot imagine it. This matter is enormously fascinating, and a wise man will hesitate to speak patronizingly about it. Nevertheless, considering matter apart from the mind which studies it, we decide that it represents a low stage of being. We speak contemptuously of stones and clods and lumps of clay. We award more respect to things like mountains and tempest-tossed oceans because they are big. In the early days of our race, we used to worship these things, but now we think of them merely as the raw material of life, and we should not be in the least interested in becoming a mountain or an ocean. Almost everyone would agree, therefore, that what we call life is a higher and more important achievement of nature. And if we wish to grade this life, we do so according to its sentience, that is to say, the amount and intensity of the consciousness which grows in it. We are interested in the one-celled organism which swarm everywhere throughout nature, and we study the mysterious processes by which they nourish and beget themselves. We suspect that they have a germ of consciousness in them. We are surer of the meaning and importance of the consciousness we detect in some complex organism like a fish or bird. We learn to know the signs of consciousness, of dawning intelligence, and we esteem the various kinds of creatures according to the amount of it they possess. We reject mere physical bigness and mere strength. Joyce Kilmer may write, "Poems are made by men like me, but only God can make a tree." And that seems to us a charming bit of fancy, but the common sense of the thing is voiced to as much better in the lines of old Ben Jonson. "It is not growing like a tree, in bulk doth make men better be." If we take two animals of equal bulk, the hippopotamus and the elephant, we shall be far more interested in the elephant because of the intelligence and what we call character which he displays. There are good elephants and bad elephants, kind ones and treacherous ones. We love the dog because we can make a companion of him. That is, because we can teach him to react to human stimuli. Of all animals, we are fascinated most by the monkey because he is nearest to man and displays the keenest intelligence. Someone may say this is all mere human egotism and that we have no way of really being sure that life of elephants and hippopotami is not more interesting and significant than the life of men. Never having been either of these animals, I cannot say with assurance, but I know that I have the power to exterminate these creatures or to pen them in cages, and they are helpless to protect themselves, or even to understand what is happening to them. So I am irresistibly driven to conclude that intelligence is more safe and more worthwhile than unintelligence. In short, that intelligence is nature's highest product up to date, and that to foster and develop it is the best guess I can make as to the path of wisdom that is of intelligence. When we come to deal with human values, we find that we can trace much of the same kind of evolution. Back in the days of the caveman, it was physical strength which dominated the horde, but nowadays, except in the imagination of the small boy, the strong man does not cut much of a figure. We go once, perhaps, to see him lift his heavy weights and break his iron bars, but then we are tired of him. Mere strength had to yield in the struggle for life to quickness of eye and hand, to energy which, for lack of a better name, we may call nervous. The pugilist who has nothing but muscle goes down before his lighter antagonist who can keep out of his reach, and the crowd loves the football hero who can duck and dodge and make the long runs. One might cite 1,000 illustrations, such as the British bowmen breaking down the heavily armored knights, or the quick-moving light vessels of Britain overcoming the huge galleons of Spain. And as society develops and becomes more complex, the fighting man becomes less and less a man of muscle and more a man of nerve. Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon would have stood a poor chance in personal combat against many of their followers. They led because they were men of energy and cunning, able to maintain the subtle thing we call prestige. Now the world has moved into an industrial era, and who are the great men of our time? The men whose lightest words are heeded, whose doings are spread upon the front pages of our newspapers. Obviously, they are the men of money. We may pretend to ourselves that we do not really stand in awe of a Morgan or a Rockefeller, but that we admire, let us say, an Edison or a Roosevelt. But Edison himself is a man of money, and will tell you that he had to be a man of money in order to be free to conduct his experiments. As for our politicians and statesmen, they either serve the men of money or the men of money suppress them, as they did Roosevelt. The Morgans and the Rockefellers do not do much talking. They do not have to. They content themselves with being obeyed, and the shaping of our society is in their hands. And yet, some of us really believe that there are higher faculties in man than the ability to manipulate the stock market. We consider that the great inventor, the great poet, the great moralist contributes more to human happiness than the man who, by cunning and persistence, succeeds in monopolizing some material necessity of human life. Poets, says Shelley, are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. If this strange statement is anywhere near to truth, it is surely of importance that we should decide what are the higher powers in men and how they may be recognized and fostered and developed. What is, in its essence, the process of evolution from the lower to the higher forms of mental life? It is a process of expanding consciousness, the developing of ability to apprehend a wider and wider circle of existence, to share it, to struggle for it as we do for the life we call our own. The test of the higher mental forms is therefore a test of universality, of sympathetic inclusiveness, or, to use commoner words, it is a test of enlightened unselfishness. Every human individual has the will to life, the instinct of self-preservation, which persuades him that he is of importance. But the test of his development is his ability to realize that, important though he may be, he is but a small part of the universe, and his highest interests are not in himself alone. His highest duties are not owed to himself alone. And as the life becomes more of the intellect, this fact becomes more and more obvious, more and more dominating. Men who monopolize the material things of the world and their control are necessarily self-seeking. But in the realm of the higher faculties, this element, in the very nature of the case, is forced into the background. It is evident that truth is not truth for the Standard Oil Company, nor for J.P. Morgan and Company, nor yet for the government of the United States. It is truth for the whole of mankind, and one who sincerely labors for the truth does so for the universal benefit. There may be, of course, an element of selfishness in the activities of poets and inventors. They may be seeking for fame. They may be hoping to make money out of their discoveries. But the greatest men we know have been dominated by an overwhelming impulse of creation. And when we read their lives and discover in them signs of petty vanity or jealousy or greed, we are pained and shocked. What touches us most deeply is some mark of self-consecration and humility. As for example, when Newton tells us that after all his life's labor, he felt himself as a little child gathering seashells on the seashore of the great ocean of truth. Or when Alfred Russel Wallace, discovering that Darwin had been working longer than himself over the theory of the origin of species, generously withdrew and permitted the theory to go to the world in Darwin's name. There are three faculties in man, usually described as intellect, feeling, and will. According as one of the other faculty predominates, we have a great scientist, a great poet, or a great moralist. We might choose a representative of each type, let us say Newton, Shakespeare, and Jesus, and spend much time in controversy as to which of the three types is the greatest, which makes the greatest contribution to human happiness. But it will suffice here to point out that the three faculties do not exclude one another. Every man must have all three, and a perfectly rounded man should seek to develop all three. Jesus was considerable of a poet, and we should pay far less heed to Shakespeare if he had not been a moralist. Also, there have been instances of great poets and painters who were scientists, for example, Leonardo and Goethe. The fundamental difference between the scientist and the poet is that one is exploring nature and discovering things which actually exist, whereas the other is creating new life out of his own spirit. But the poet will find that his creations take but little hold upon life if they are not guided and shaped by a deeper understanding of life's fundamental nature and needs. In other words, if the poet is not something of a scientist. And in the same way, the very greatest discoveries of science seem to us like leaps of creative imagination, as if the mind had completed nature through some intuitive and sympathetic understanding of what nature wished to be. The point about these higher forms of human activity is that they renew and multiply life. We may say that if Jesus had never lived, others would have embodied and set forth with equal poignancy and revolutionary idea of the equality of all men as children of one common Father. And perhaps this is true, but we have no way of being sure that it is true. And as we look back upon the last 1900 years of human history, we are unable to imagine just what the life of mankind during those centuries would have been if Jesus had died when he was a baby. We do not know what modern thought might have been without Kant, or what modern music might have been without Beethoven. We are forced to admit that if it had not been for the patient wisdom and persuasive kindness of Lincoln, the slave power might have won its independence, and America today might have been a military camp like Europe, and the lives and thoughts of every one of us would have been different. Or take the activities of the poet. Many years ago, the writer was asked to name the men who had exercised the greatest influence upon him, and after much thought, he named 3: Jesus, Hamlet, and Shelley. And now consider the significance of this reply. One of these people, Shelley, was what we call a real person. That is, a man who actually lived and walked upon the earth. Concerning Hamlet, it is believed there was once a prince of Denmark by that name, but the character who is known to us as Hamlet is the creation of a poet's brain. As to the third figure, Jesus, the authorities dispute. Some say that he was a man who actually lived. Others believe that he was God on earth. Yet others, very learned, maintain that he is a legendary name around which a number of traditions have gathered. To me, it does not make a particular of difference Which of the three possibilities happen to be true about Jesus? If he was God on earth, he was God in human form, under human limitations, and in that sense, we are all gods on earth. And whether he really lived, or whether some poet invented him, matters not a particular so far as concerns his effect upon others. The emotions which moved him, the loves, the griefs, the high resolves existed in the soul of someone, whether his name were Jesus or John. And these emotions have been recorded in such form that they communicate themselves to us. They become a part of our souls. They make us something different from what we were before we encountered them. In other words, the poet makes in his own soul a new life and then projects it into the world, and it becomes a force which makes over the lives of millions of other people. If you read the vast mass of criticism which has grown up about the figure of Hamlet, you learn that Hamlet is the type of modern man. Shakespeare was able to divine what the modern man would be. Or perhaps we can go farther and say that Shakespeare helped to make the modern man what he is. The modern man is more of Hamlet because he has taken Hamlet to his heart and pondered over Hamlet's problem. Or take Don Quixote. No doubt the follies of the age of chivalry would have died out of men's hearts in the end. But how much sooner they died because of the laughter of Cervantes. Or take Les Miserables. Our prison system is not ideal by any means, but it is far less cruel than it was half a century ago, and we owe this in part to Victor Hugo. Every convict in the world is to some degree a happier man because of this vision, which was projected upon the world from the soul of one great poet. No one can estimate the part which the writings of Tolstoy have played in the present revolution in Russia. But this we may say with certainty. There is not one man, woman, or child in Russia at the present moment who is quite the same as he would have been if Resurrection had never been written. In discussing the highest faculties of man, we have so far refrained from using the word genius. It is a word which has been cheapened by misuse, but we are now in position to use it. The things which we have just been considering are the phenomena of genius, as we can say this, even though we may not know exactly what genius is. Perhaps it is, as Frederick Myers asserts, a subliminal uprush, the welling up into the consciousness of some part of the content of the subconscious mind. Or perhaps it is something of what man calls divine. Or perhaps it is the first dawning, the first hint of that super race which will someday replace mankind. Perhaps we're witnessing the same thing that happened on the earth when glimmerings of reason first broke upon the mind of some poor, bewildered ape. We cannot be sure. But this much we can say. The man of genius represents the highest activity of the mind of which we as yet have knowledge. He represents the spirit of man, fully emancipated, fully conscious, and taking up the task of creation, taking human life as raw material and making it over into something more subtle, more intense, more significant, more universal than it ever was before, or ever would have been without the intervention of this new God-man. And we've now reached the end of chapter 9. All right, good stuff, huh? Leave me your comment. Let me know you were here. And before you head out, hit that like button. Thank you so much. And meet me over at the next video where I will be there with chapter 10.